Morris Berman is a prominent cultural historian and social critic and author of many books, including Why America Failed, The Roots of Imperial Decline, The Dark Ages of America, and most recently, a book called Neurotic Beauty, An Outsider Looks at Japan. This is Morris Berman's second visit to the Soapbox. Welcome back to the Soapbox, Morris.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
It's my pleasure. So, Morris, recently we were sort of corresponding via email, and I think given the recent events at the time of the recording of this interview, the tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina, you made a connection to Chapter 4 of your book, Why America Failed. The Rebuke of History is the title of the chapter. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on that for me and for our listeners.
Yeah, the thing that occurred to me, one of the things that occurred to me in the wake of that awful event was that the Civil War never really ended. That's the implication of that chapter. One of the things I talk about in that chapter is that the United States had a habit, starting from the genocide of the Native Americans, of a scorched earth policy, but it was also a scorched soul policy. The idea was to destroy the identity, the consciousness of the enemy. The enemy was, whoever it was totally evil. And here in the case in North versus South, with slavery, once you say that the South is about nothing else but slavery, then of course it's the ultimate evil. And you don't have to think about it in any other terms. And in a sense, that kind of humiliation that was visited upon the South meant that it left a mortal wound from which we never really recovered. And so, what you have is that the war went underground. So lynchings occurred down to 1950 or so? Mm-hmm. And now we have this massacre in South Carolina. Now, I'm not saying that all hatred of blacks and this particular event can be assigned to the vilification of the South. There are lots of factors at play that keep racism going, of course. But it seems to me that one of the factors is that if you make your enemy completely evil and believe that they have absolutely nothing to say to us, which we've done in the case of Iraq, which we did in the case of Vietnam, the Soviet Union, the list is just quite lengthy. You never learn anything yourself, and the cost to you is quite dear. And so the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction is just still with us. And you have, also as a result, outside of, a massacre like this one, you have, a part of the nation that really can't do enough to sabotage any movement toward real progress. It has a contempt for science or sexual diversity, aid to the elderly, women's rights, everything is no. And, that's basically the legacy of being treated like dirt, that you create this fracture or kind of mortal wound, I think, in our history. And as I said, this fellow Dylan Ruff, or however his name is pronounced, obviously he's a very, very disturbed kind of guy, but he's also the product of a culture. And that resentment just festers and festers and festers. And the fact is that we will never solve the race problem in the United States. It's beyond our solution now.
So can you tie that to the Black Lives Matter movement? And do you see any sort of corollary between, say, the lynchings that continued to happen and did happen in the South and the police killings that are occurring, or is that a different animal?
Well, that's an interest. The whole thing. I'm not really an expert on all this sort of stuff, but I have to say that it's getting quite obvious with the incarceration rates, for example, of young black males in the United States. This is not about personal animus. This is a sociological phenomenon, and the murder rate of the shooting of black men and so on. I do think it's connected, although that's not just a Southern phenomenon. And in addition, it's not. I don't think it's really. I think it goes beyond being a racial issue in that of the 5,000 unarmed civilians, roughly give or take, that police across the country have murdered between 2001 and 2011. Many of them were not black. You have a whole spectrum of who gets killed, and the larger issue, I think, in that case is that as the American dream falls apart, which is what we're witnessing today, 1 out of 5 people are unemployed, and they're not going to find employment for the rest of their lives. I mean, that seems to, or maybe they'll find partial employment, but the real unofficial record of unemployment now is something like 18%. And when the economy worsens and the American dream falls apart, people start looking for scapegoats, and the tension ratchets up, and blacks will be scapegoats. But finally, you have a police that is militarized from our foreign adventures, and they themselves don't trust the American dream. They're trigger happy, and basically people start to turn on each other. And I saw in Charleston, what occurred to me was that we're now eating ourselves alive. We're devouring each other. And that will continue to go on. I don't know whether the next massacre will be of a white person killing black people. There's no way I can say that there will be the next massacre. But one thing I can tell you is there will be a next massacre. Just wait. There's no question about that anymore. We go from massacre to massacre. And then on a daily basis, if you just go online and check CNN or whatever, there's a shooting somewhere of some guy who kills about 4 people in his household or something like that. There are many massacres going on a daily basis. There's not a day that I don't go online and see a shooting, and don't see one. They're there all the time. And so what's going on really beyond the race issue, as important as that is that the country's coming apart at the seams.
And so, obviously the rates of violence in America are disproportionately higher than rates around the world. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you, throughout your writing, you suggest that there is a poison that has been present in American culture from its inception that maybe contributes to this avariciousness and this greed and the violence that comes, this consumptive violence. Can you is that correct, first of all, and if so, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and one thing that occurred to me while you were talking, Eric, about those stats, that exist, you can just go online and find them, the stats of comparative countries, homicide rates, and so on. The most recent one I read a few days ago was that, I think it was between 2011 and 2013, 2 or 3 people had been killed by the police in Great Britain. 2 or 3.
Yeah.
What are the comparative stats? I think it's already 500 for the year 2015, down to May. The police have killed something like 500 people already. Here's a 2 or 3 year span in which 2 or 3 people are killed in Great Britain. So it tells you something about the difference of the countries. And of course, recently, the other day, in his appeal for gun reform, which will be totally futile, Obama said, we have to look at the fact that other countries don't have our statistics. And that's absolutely correct. They don't. A lot of this is that, I do talk about this in the trilogy I did on the American Empire, that we have certain characteristics, unconscious programs that are deeply sewn into the American psyche and that go back a long ways. And one of it is a kind of hyper-individualism, which results in turning out movies like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, this type of heroic figure who is actually pathological. I mean, from a non-American viewpoint, from an outsider's viewpoint, a pretty pathological character.
And quite antisocial, too. I mean...
Yeah, absolutely. They do everything on their own. They're not connected to anybody. You know, I mean, it's this kind of thing. And also, they're always toting a gun. And so you have a kind of super-individualism. And then another thing that's sewn into the American psyche is the notion of the endless frontier. This is associated with the historian Frederick Jackson, Turner, who said that basically the idea was that there was this endless geographical frontier, but after that it became an economic frontier and a technological frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner, and a psychological frontier. And so the idea is that we expand indefinitely. Well, it's kind of hard to do that when there are other countries around, and finally it's kind of hard to do that in a world of finite resources. But the idea is, I mean, the American mode that I talk about in Why America Failed from the beginning was that we were always about hustling. We were always about opportunism. We were always about making a buck and getting ahead. And finally, you put all those factors together, and you have one of the most dysfunctional countries in the history of the world, which can't go on like this, and it's why we're devouring ourselves and eating ourselves alive. There is no future in a country that I think from the beginning really was spiritually bankrupt. Hustling can't be a belief system, although we tried to make it one. We call it the American dream, you know. And the thing is that every American, rich or poor, smart or dumb, male or female, whatever, believes in the American dream. And now that it's no longer viable, there's a kind of rage that has quickly come to the surface. And I don't know, when I look at a guy like, Dylan Roth, I think, yeah, I'm sure that racism and the way he was raised is a very important factor, but I can't help wondering if there's a kind of narcissism at work as well. Look at me. I'm important. I made history. Look at me.
Well, let me ask you about that, too, because isn't there sort of, isn't it possible that there's this desperation in a culture that so devalues individuals? Isn't there a desperation to make oneself important in their own mind? I mean, obviously, this is reprehensible, but I think there's this weird pathology that these people inadvertently end up subscribing to. That, well, if I do something notorious, then all of a sudden my life has meaning and it's worthwhile. Isn't that sort of a symptom of a culture that doesn't know the meaning of the word meaning?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on it. If basically you're going to derive meaning from something like standing out, having to distinguish yourself, then, the mode in which you distinguish yourself may become less and less important. And that may have been operative in this case. I don't know.
Well, let me ask you this, too, because you mentioned President Obama mentioning something about gun control. And, I mean, these things, these stories are just happening over and over again with, increasing rapidity. With Sandy Hook, I mean, we've been here before, and it's failed. And now we've got a new presidential election coming up. And whether it's Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, we've been here before with politicians promising the world to us. And, are we on the precipice, do you think, in America, of collectively coming to our senses and recognizing that, these are just stories, that there's no substance here? I mean, there's not going to be meaningful gun reform. There's not going to be meaningful political reform from within the system, or are we doomed to sort of continue sleepwalking into oblivion?
The latter. That's where we're at. I heard Obama talking about the need for gun control and so on, and his voice was so depressed because he realized that it wasn't going to happen. It doesn't matter what he says. Already you've got all these Republicans rallying to the NRA and the notion that we have to preserve the Second Amendment as they understand the Second Amendment. And so, how many massacres? I mean, maybe if one gunman got loose with an AK-47 and killed 300 people, maybe there might be some reconsideration of semi-automatic weapons. But otherwise, as you say, we're just rerunning the same scenarios. And the notion, it's just hand-wringing. We're running out of adjectives. How many times can you say senseless, atrocious? We're just running out of adjectives for these massacres. And nothing will be done. Or nothing will be done in terms of race relations or gun control or anything. It will just be, things will quiet down again, excuse me, and then we'll just wait until the next massacre. But in terms of putting our hopes on somebody like Hillary or Bernie and so on and so forth, that's the great progressive fallacy. Excuse me. Sorry. Mm-hmm. That's the great progressive fallacy. It was with Obama in 2008. Mm-hmm. People who really ought to have been smarter than that, known better than that, talked about the election as transformative. Mm-hmm. Michael Moore said, we're sweeping the nation. All it needs is the sweeping of Michael Moore's brain. We don't need to sweep. The nation isn't going to get swept. And so finally, do you recognize, it's an old graffito from the 1960s, if elections could change anything, they would be declared illegal. Mm-hmm. And when is it going to happen that you're going to stop saying, oh, Hillary, oh, Bernie? We said, oh, Obama. How many times can you say, oh? Finally, there should be a point. But progressives never do that. The next so-called liberal candidate is going to change anything. But the point is that elections are bought for by, Wall Street. And you have to play to an agenda in general that the whole country buys into, not just Wall Street. That the American dream makes sense, American exceptionalism makes sense, being an empire makes sense, cruelly destroying other people on the other side of the globe. Something like 62% of Americans polled are in favor of drone strikes, knowing that this kills innocent women and children. 52% have come out in favor of torture. This is the American public we're dealing with. Well, to quote George Carlin, where do you think our leaders come from? Mars? They are a reflection of the populace. And so, hey, you get what you pay for.
One of the things we've been talking about here on the Soapbox is sort of a theme that's been emerging over the past few months is the difference between liberalism and, say, a more radical leftist ideology. And so Eric Alterman, who's a columnist for The Nation, has come on the show and considers himself a liberal and has written a number of books in defense of liberalism. And he said, to be a liberal in America today is to be the furthest left a person can be in terms of labels and still have a voice in the mainstream discourse. And his critique of radicals is that they aren't practical, that they're not able to engage the system as it exists and work the levers to bring about actual reform or change. And I'm wondering, correct me if I'm wrong again, but it sounds like you're even operating further out from both of those terms. And I think, do you think both liberals and, say, radicals are deluded in thinking that they could have any impact whatsoever?
Yeah, I think Eric Alterman certainly is. He's right about the fact that genuine radicals, people who mount a fundamental critique of this society. I would name a figure, let's say, like Ralph Nader, mm-hmm. Okay, who, excuse me, who really has no truck with the liberal establishment.
Not anymore. He used to.
No, but he also understands that if he he himself running for office, what does he get, 1 to 2% of the vote, if that? So, he understands that he has no way of influencing, from a radical position, he has no way of influencing America, and Eric Alterman is right about that. But the point is, what is it exactly that liberals can do? Once you're working within the system, all you can do is reproduce the system. And these very slight modifications, Bernie Sanders has courted the military in order to get, jobs and contracts in the state of Vermont. And when he's in office, he won't be, but if he were in office, he would do the same thing. And Hillary is a hawk. She's rattling the sabers against Iran and Russia and so on. What does the word liberal mean anymore? And what is it that Eric Alterman thinks he stands for? So in that sense, I can't imagine that either of these two camps have any influence on the United States at all. And certainly, if we're going to have any radical type of change in the United States, my guess is that it would come from the right, not from the left.
Well, in terms of historically speaking in America, there have been, let's say, flashes or moments of movement to genuine democratic alternative systems to the existing system. And the last one that posed a real challenge, arguably, was the populist movement at the end of the 19th century. And I recently read a book by Lawrence Goodwin called The Populist Moment. It's an abridged version of a longer study he did. And if you'll bear with me a moment, I'd like to read you a brief quote and sort of get your thoughts on whether or not this was indeed an effective form of resistance, or let me just read the quote here.
Yeah, go ahead.
The departure of a culturally sanctioned tradition of serious democratic reform thought created self-negating options. He's speaking about the end of the populist movement. Reformers could ignore the need for cultural credentials, insist on serious analysis, and accept their political irrelevance as quote-unquote socialists, or they could forsake the pursuit of serious structural reform and acquire mainstream credentials as, quote, progressives and liberals. In either case, they could not hope to achieve what populists had dared to pursue: cultural acceptance of a democratic politics open to serious structural evolution of society. The demonstrated effectiveness of the new political methods of mass advertising mean, in effect, that the cultural values of the corporate state were politically unassailable in 20th century America. Was that a turning point in America, Morris, or was that just another example of an ineffective movement barely breathing?
Yeah, there were also, I think of the Wobblies, for example. There were all sorts of, movements during that time, the Gilded Age. But in the end, when the dust settles, it really is about the American dream and this basic way of life. Naomi Klein was right when she said that what we need is a new civilizational paradigm. Socialism isn't it, and Occupy Wall Street isn't it, because what they're talking about is the redistribution of wealth, which would be nice. It would be an advantage. It would be better than what we have, and certainly, the New Deal attempted to do that to some small extent. But that's not a different type of structure. It really isn't, finally. It's still about technological and economic expansion. It's just that it's a fairer mode of technological and economic expansion, but it's still the same thing. And, at the end of it, I would have to say, as far as socialism goes, I don't think Franklin Roosevelt was a socialist. Most historians would agree with me when I say that his historical function was to save capitalism, and he did. And so it's sort of like, envisioning a very, very different type of society, and I don't see that ever happening with any society. The way that things begin, it's sort of like the formation of the human personality. Freud said that by age 5 it was all over, and you were going to evolve in certain ways, but the basic tram lines of the personality by 5 or 7 are pretty much well laid out. I would say that's true of countries as well. The United States can't suddenly become a different country. And so the question to ask is, given the parameters of the definition of what America is, where is it headed? And my answer to that would be down the drain. This is not a viable system anymore. It's being eaten alive by its own contradictions. And so, I don't think that the upsurgence of things like populism or the New Deal and so on finally made that much of a difference.